Hello there, and welcome to Scully's Corner. I am Steve with the Chico Comics page, and I will be looking at Star Wars Insider, The Saga Begins. Today we will be looking at this, and it is a collection of articles and segments by Titan Comics that was originally presented in the Star Wars Insider magazine. It must be at least over 15 years ago now. Certainly some of these articles are probably about 17 years or older. So kind of expect that the information isn't going to be the most current, but it will give you the recollections of these actors and production people at the time. As for the cover itself, it's not the most exciting, but it does the job. It's a black and white cover production still with Anakin Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi as of Episode 3. Although my own history with the prequels is not the best, I actually am a big fan of Episode 3, and I really kind of like the way that they use this particular picture. I think it brings out the best in both of them, and I think that the choice of black and white is a little odd, I suppose, but I think it does kind of get the idea of the tone of the prequels, so it gets that across fairly well. Notes on context here, because I think it's important to understand a few things. Firstly, again, these were all published around the time of the prequel trilogy, so these are very old. Keep in mind also that this is pre-Disney. So this is before Disney acquired the Star Wars intellectual property. So don't expect any references to the sequels. Don't expect any references to Kylo Ren. Don't even expect any references to Star Wars Rebels, really. That's not what this is about. These are all articles that were published prior to that. So if you're a fan of the sequels, if you're a fan of Star Wars Rebels or anything done after the Disney acquisition, don't expect to find anything about that here. You may see references to the original expanded universe, however. Prior to the Disney acquisition, there was a Star Wars expanded universe that Lucas oversaw, and there are certain elements that tie together with the books and the comics that were published under the auspices of Lucasfilm. A lot of these articles are publicity sort of pieces. These are interviews that are designed to raise awareness and interest in the movie. So if you're looking for critical examination of, why Episode 1 is so bad, this is not for you. You're not going to find that here. That having been said, it will be useful if you're a hardcore fan of Star Wars, if you are a fan of the prequels, or even if you just want to look back at the prequels in a new light now that we're approaching the end of the sequel trilogy. So if you want to think about, okay, what was going on at that time, how Lucas approached the prequels, you may find something here for you. So firstly, we're going to talk about what you can expect to find in this. It's 179 pages of content, so there's a lot of stuff here for you to look at. Now, firstly, there's going to be an interview with George Lucas. They start and end with that, for the most part. There is a short piece towards the end, also with Lucas, but there is a larger interview with Lucas at the beginning, and that's got some fairly interesting content. He goes more into the craft of movie making. It's a little bit more personal than I think that you're going to expect, but you're going to see how he looks at film, which I think is very useful. There are interviews with most of the main actors of the series. There are some notable exceptions, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But nearly everybody from Episode 1 is in it. People like Ewan McGregor, Liam Neeson, Natalie Portman, all these sorts of people that you sort of expect. And there also includes a lot of little pieces with actors from Episode 1 that you probably didn't realize were in it. Some of these might be a little bit of a surprise to you. And if you're kind of interested in seeing all those things, by all means, look at this. There's a lot of really interesting ideas and interesting characters that you probably gave a second glance, and they go into detail about who they are and who their actors are, and some of them are decently well known. Brian Bless is mentioned in there, and he's Boss Nass. Lindsay Duncan is a protocol droid. So if you want to look at that, by all means, look into this book. There are also a discussion of Easter eggs in Episode 1. There are quite a few Easter eggs that are listed in it, not just to Star Wars continuity, though there's plenty of that, but there is also references to other movies. They talk about the pod from 2001. There are little references to The Wizard of Oz, various little other things as well. But if you're an Episode 1 fan and you're interested in the expanded universe, there are some references to Kyle Katarn and those sorts of characters, if you're interested in that. Their interview with a number of the production crew, people like Ralph McQuarrie and Doug Chiang. There are also a number of production pictures associated with them that you'll find in there as well, and there's some interesting thoughts that they had. And then, for the most part, it's still pictures, it's concept pictures, promotional pictures, those sorts of things. And that's a lot of content in episode 1, so there's a lot of things for you if you're interested in that film particularly. There also are discussions of episode 2. There's an interview with the screenwriter on that film. There is a segment on designing Dexter's Diner and the design of the Dexter character, if you're interested in that little bit. I actually kind of like that particular segment of that movie, even though that movie was really kind of a miss for me overall. But I kind of liked, that particular bit because it did humanize Obi-Wan. And I like the sort of pseudo-50s aesthetic to that. So if you're interested in that, it's right there for you. There's a discussion of the monsters of episode 2, the creatures. There are a lot of different creatures that appear in episode 2, particularly during the Battle of Geonosis. So if you're interested in Geonosis, if you're interested in the creature designs, plenty of that. John Williams. I think we know most of his iconic music. If you're interested in what Williams has to say, he has a fairly substantial interview in this book. Production design interviews with the episode 3 staff. You have the costume designer, you have the director of photography, the prop designer, a bunch of other people that were involved in the making of episode 3. So, there's a fair amount of content. Unfortunately, there's not enough of it, but, this book is what it is. Now, talk about the downsides to this book and kind of where I think it goes wrong a little bit in terms of its content. Keep in mind that most of it is episode 1. Something like 79 pages, I believe, are almost entirely episode 1 out of a book that is 179 pages. So yeah, I think if you're interested more in episodes 2 and 3, you may be relatively disappointed. If, like me, you are a huge fan of episode 3, you're really going to be unhappy relatively to the other 2. So just be warned that a lot of the material was from the first episode. You're not going to get as much for episode 3 in particular. 2 is okay, but less, I would say. And then they miss also things I would have liked to have seen in this and that unfortunately for whatever reason aren't. And it may just be because they didn't have the material. I'm not particularly blaming anybody at Titan for this or anybody involved with Star Wars Insider for this. It could just be that they didn't have it, but it is unfortunate. And that is, number one, there's only a very short interview with Ian McDiarmid, who plays Emperor Palpatine. That is very unfortunate because Palpatine is the big villain of the entire Star Wars saga, really. And, he's not anywhere in this. So it's like, if you want to know about how he looks at Emperor Palpatine, and if you want to see, his thoughts on what his character's role has been through the Star Wars saga, you're not going to get very much of that because there's only half a page out of 179 pages, and that's unfortunate. But at least he gets a little bit of exposure. Unfortunately, if you are a fan of Count Dooku, and if you like Christopher Lee, and I am a huge fan of Christopher Lee, he's not in this book at all. I am sorry. He's just not in there at all. And that was kind of unfortunate, because I was looking through this when I read it, looking to see, when is Christopher Lee going to show up, hoping that he would be in episode 3 discussion. And unfortunately, there is nothing there. There are substantial interviews with Liam Neeson and with Ray Park, who played Darth Maul. There's with Natalie Portman, with Hayden Christensen. But Christopher Lee's nowhere. And Christopher Lee is, the villain of episode 2. And he shows up in episode 3 and he's nowhere. General Grievous, and I can understand if you're not a fan of General Grievous. I have to say I wasn't either until the Clone Wars, but he's not in this either, and there's not a discussion about how General Grievous was created, nothing about any of that, and that is unfortunate as well, because he's a big part of episode 3 and he's not there. If you're a fan of the Clone Wars cartoon, like I am, unfortunately don't expect very much content related to that. There are some small references within the book, but unfortunately it's kind of overlooked. That might be outside of the purview of the book, and I'm certainly not going to fault Titan for that either. I think they probably did what they could with the material that was available to them, but unfortunately, that is regrettable because the Clone Wars, I think, helps bring the prequel trilogy together in a lot of ways. It helps to improve the way that we look at these characters, and it helps to connect things between the trilogy, in ways that maybe makes more sense than just looking at the films by themselves. So that's unfortunate. And also, the text can sometimes be small to read. I had a hard time, but I was reading it on a digital copy. If you have the physical copy, it may be better. So this is just a ding on the digital version, but again, I'm not blaming Titan for that. That is what it is. These are reprints from old magazines, and they probably were not designed for digital versions. That's fine. Now, on the whole, I would say that this is good content. At least in terms of the interviews, at least in terms of these things. It's just that there are some glaring holes in it. If that doesn't bother you, then by all means pick it up. If it does, then you may want to think about it, or at least wait for a sale on Amazon or Comixology or wherever it's available. Now we'll talk a little bit about the art that is featured here. Keep in mind that this is really going to be more of a content-focused review. The photo stills of the cast and the moments in the prequels that are available, they're all in there. A number of these are things you've probably seen, so don't expect some surprises. There are other ones, however, that are probably a little bit less likely for you to find, but it's all available. You should be able to find it. You'll find Ralph McQuarrie's artwork, which we discussed previously. There actually includes a storyboards for scenes in episode 2, and I believe there's also brief storyboards for episode 3 as well. So if you're interested in the process of storyboarding, how storyboards look, how they're designed, by all means look at those. They're not a huge part of the book, but they're a decent chunk of it. There are costume design stills and sketches for episode 3. There are concept designs for the Wookiee planet of Kashyyyk. I believe that's how you pronounce it. There's production design of the magazine itself. It's quite good. The production values are quite high. Everything's arranged well on the page. I mean, there's nothing that looks like it's bad. The only real problem is that the text can sometimes be hard to read on the digital copy. But overall, the look of the magazine is good. I don't think there are any real problems with that. Just kind of keep in mind that the focus should be on the content and the information that's in the book itself. And now we're at Scully's Corner, where we'll give some closing thoughts about this particular book. Overall, this is a good collection. I mean, it's 179 pages of content. If you're a fan of episode 1 particularly, you'll like that. I don't see really any issues with that. Now, if you're more of a fan of the later films, and you're probably going to be more disappointed. But if you like episode 1, you'll like this. Keep in mind that this is definitely aimed for fans of the prequels. If you're, somebody like a Mr. Plinkett and really thinks that these movies are terrible, and this is not for you, because this is not one of those things that are going to give you like a tell-all sort of thing about how awful things were. No, there's none of that. It's definitely designed for publicity. It's definitely designed to promote these movies. So I would expect some of that. Now, again, the major disappointments are the overemphasis of episode 1 content. There is just a ton of episode 1 content, which I don't mind, but I do mind that there's almost nothing for episode 3, or at least very little, and there's really not a whole lot for episode 2, and that's kind of unfortunate, because I've always considered the prequels to have gotten better over the course of the films. And 3 was the best, and really there really isn't so much for that, and that's unfortunate. The lack of Christopher Lee, the limited amount of Ian McDiarmid, and no General Grievous at all, those are big, big minuses in my view. You can't just leave out all the villains if you're trying to do a comprehensive look at the prequels. And though I would have liked to have seen some more references to the Clone Wars, at least for page, it doesn't include that, but it's not something I would strike against the book. It's just one of those things. Overall, though, there's far more good and bad than this. If you're a fan of episode 1, if you're a fan of the prequels in general, I mean, there's good content here. There's some great interviews. If you really want to look at how George Lucas looks at this, if you want to look at how the production designers look at this, if you want to look at John Williams' interview, all of that is good. You're not going to be unhappy with those things. Just kind of keep in mind that you want to temper your expectations a little bit. If you're expecting, a lot of later episode content, you're probably not going to find that here. But if you're a big fan of episode 1 and you like, these particular actors and you want to know exactly what was going on in episode 1 in particular, yeah, that's perfectly fine. So all in all, I would give Star Wars Insider: The Saga Begins a pod racing 8.5 out of 10. It's certainly not a bad book at all. I would say if you like this sort of content, if you're really a hardcore prequel trilogy fan, absolutely get it. If you're one of those people that's kind of sort of on the fence, you probably don't want to go out of your way to get this. But, I think that you're not going to be disappointed if you decide to try it. Thank you. This is Steve with Scully's Crew, signing off.